The Camden Yards area, occupied since the early 18th century, experienced its first brush with history in 1781, when the great French General Comte de Rochambeau and his troops camped there en route to join General George Washington against the British at Yorktown in the final battle of the Revolutionary War. But it was nearly a half a century later, on July 4th, 1828, that Camden Yards' real story began, with the laying of the cornerstone for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in Baltimore by Charles Carroll, the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence. In 1852, as the B&O was moving west into the Ohio Valley and the tracks were nearing Wheeling, Virginia, now West Virginia, the directors of the railroad decided to build a station of size, dignity, and beauty to showcase the successes of the rapidly expanding railroad. The B&O purchased 3 residential city blocks between Howard and Utah Streets for $230,000 and selected 2 former B&O civil engineer, John R. Nearnsey and J. Crawford Nielsen, to design the new Camden Station. The 3-story east and west wings with 3-story cupola-topped 80-foot towers were completed in 1865. Nearnsey and Nielsen are also known for their design of other Baltimore landmarks, including the old Calvert Station, Johns Hopkins Hospital, and the Hackerman House, which is now part of the Walters Art Gallery at Mount Vernon Place. From 1856 to 1876, the station served the only rail line to Washington, D.C. from the north, and during that period, every president of the United States, northern senator, and congressman passed through Camden Station on the way to Washington. The B&O Railroad was vital to the Union Civil War effort, and in the thick of action during the war as men and material passed through the station on the way south and west. In 1859, the news that John Brown had attacked the arsenal at Harper's Ferry was first received in the station's telegraph office, and the stage was set for the impending Civil War. Abraham Lincoln made the first of 3 trips through Camden Station in the early morning hours of November 22, 1861. He had been elected president and left Springfield, Illinois, for his inauguration in Washington, D.C. His original plan was to tour cities on the East Coast. In Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, however, one of his bodyguards, Allen Pinkerton, former sheriff of Cook County, Illinois, and first head of the United States Secret Service, advised Lincoln of a plot by secessionist sympathizers to wreck his train and assassinate him in Baltimore. Lincoln's route was altered, his train blacked out, guards posted along the new route, and telegraph lines cut between Philadelphia and Baltimore. His transfer from the President Street Station to Camden Station occurred without incident, and he arrived safely in Washington. The Baltimore papers described the escapade and editorialized on Lincoln's efforts to avoid the public and literally sneak through Baltimore. A few months later, on April 12, 1861, the first news of the firing on Fort Sumter was carried to Baltimore through the station's telegraph office. Confederate forces, under the command of General Pierre Gustave T. Beauregard, fired on Fort Sumter, which was defended by Union soldiers under the command of Beauregard's good friend and former West Point instructor, Major Robert Anderson. Second in command of the fort was Captain Abner Doubleday, who, as a youngster in Cooperstown, New York, is purported to have created the modern concept of baseball in 1839. The fact that there were no human casualties at Fort Sumter is directly related to an event which occurred a week later involving Camden Station. After the attack on Fort Sumter, Lincoln called volunteers to Washington to protect the capital. The Union Army at that time had only 17,000 men, half of whom were stationed in the West. In response to Lincoln's request, 2 brigades of the 6th Massachusetts Infantry, totaling approximately 1,680 men, arrived in Baltimore on April 19, 1861. The troops arrived at the President Street Station 2 miles east of Camden Station in 11 cars on the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad. 9 of the horse-pulled cars passed safely up Pratt Street and went on to Washington through Camden Station. Troops from the last two cars were attacked on Pratt Street by a stone-throwing mob of about 500 Southern sympathizers. The 220 Union soldiers fought their way on foot up Pratt Street to Camden Station. 4 were killed in what is known as the infamous Baltimore Riot, or Pratt Street Riot of April 19, 1861. The Civil War's first bloodshed and casualties occurred in Baltimore in a battle between soldiers and civilians. The notion that Maryland was being invaded by Northern troops and the events that took place on April 19, 1861, inspired James Ryder Randall, a Marylander living in the Confederacy, to write "Maryland, My Maryland." The lyrics expressed his bitter feelings about the occupation of Baltimore by Union troops. It became the official state song by act of the Maryland legislature in 1939. During the Civil War, Camden Station was a stop on the Underground Railroad for slaves headed north. Many were hidden in the basement. President Lincoln passed through Camden Station for the second time on November 19, 1863, en route to dedicate the Battlefield Cemetery at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. After delivering his stirring 3-minute Gettysburg address, Lincoln returned to Washington, again passing through Camden Station. President Lincoln made his final visit to Baltimore when his 8-car funeral train arrived on April 21, 1865. For this presidential visit, the station was draped in black crepe. In the midst of the Depression of 1877, the B&O suffered from a violent railroad strike considered one of the most significant in United States history. Camden Station was the scene of a fierce confrontation between thousands of workers and the 5th and 6th Regiments of the Maryland National Guard, joined by federal troops from Fort McHenry. Rail cars and sections of the station were burned and tracks torn up. 10 strikers were killed and 13 wounded. In 1895, the 1.39-mile Howard Street Tunnel was built connecting Camden Station with Mount Royal Station. This project took 5 years to complete at a cost of $2.4 million. To accommodate increasing traffic, Camden Station was expanded and renovated. In 1897 and again in 1898, the West Tower was demolished to create a closed passageway between the station and the B&O warehouse. The renovation was completed in 1904, the year of the Great Baltimore Fire. The warehouse, one of the longest buildings in the United States, is now an integral part of Oriole Park at Camden Yards. In 1912, Baltimore was the site of the Democratic National Convention, and Camden Station underwent a $1 million improvement program. Delegates from throughout the country passed through the Grand Station. Woodrow Wilson arrived at Camden Station, was nominated as the Democratic presidential candidate on the 46th ballot, and went on to defeat 2 former presidents to become the 28th President of the United States. His defeat of Teddy Roosevelt, the Progressive Party, and William Howard Taft, a Republican, was a political first. In 1909, it was Taft who threw out the first ball on opening day, which is still a tradition. And when he stood up in the 7th inning of the game, everyone else stood up out of respect to the president. That's how we got the 7th inning stretch. Also nominated in Baltimore was Wilson's Vice President, Thomas Marshall. He is best remembered for his very profound statement, "What this country needs is a good 5-cent cigar." In World Wars I and II, many young Marylanders left home for the first time to go to war through Camden Station on their way to Fort Meade and points south and west. Our victorious men and women returned home to Camden Station at the end of the wars, many making their last trip as Lincoln did in 1865. Camden Station remained an active railroad center well into the first quarter of the 20th century. With the emergence of air travel, passenger train service lost its supremacy, and memorable rides from Camden Station on the Capital Limited to Chicago and the Royal Blue to New York became a thing of the past. The station has continued to serve commuter trains between Baltimore and Washington, and now a main stop for the new light rail system and expanded MARC service. And Camden Station is not the only National Historic Landmark in the Camden Yards area. In fact, it's only one of 4, all visible from the station and Oriole Park. The Henry Sonneborn Building, the Bromo Seltzer Tower on Utah Street, and the fully restored cast iron front Wilkins Brush Company warehouse, which sits directly opposite the station on Pratt Street.